keeping the momentum up with you for today. We've got so much planned over the next few days, carrying on with a very international theme and also sharing expertise. We're now going to be looking at Unicorn Outlook, the future of work and talent upskilling. A really topical session, and I think this will be something that it might be really good if you have questions at the end. Please do reserve your questions, and we'll make sure that we try to make the sessions interactive as well. Allow me to please introduce on stage. Now we're going to have the international correspondent from CNN, Larry Madowo. He'll be expertly moderating the session with our guest, who is Jeremy Johnson, founder and CEO of Andela, who's flown in from the US. Please do give them both a very warm round of applause. Thank you so much.
Mics are 16, 17. Yes.
Thank you. I was going to shout, but I think this is better. How's everybody doing? Jeremy, welcome to Dubai.
Thank you, Larry. Good to be here. It's
Yeah.
fun to see you in this continent.
It's
too.
great
We
to see you
keep
here.
adding on.
You just been on the road. You've been in Kenya and in Egypt.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that in a moment. But first, Andela, you were one of the first unicorns in Africa with a unique concept, a talent marketplace. Explain where you are right now. What is Andela doing?
Yeah, of course. So Andela is the world's largest technical talent marketplace. We work with talent from 175 countries around the world and are building utility to help figure out who should ultimately work where. So in a world where remote is increasingly possible, if you can quantify the output of a role or of a job, Andela makes it easy for you to find outstanding talent anywhere in the world, and then simplifies the process of how you manage, pay, and ultimately navigate compliance with and for that talent. We started off in Africa. Nigeria actually was our first country, and Africa still represents a little over half of the overall talent marketplace, which is one of the reasons the world is oftentimes surprised. They don't realize how much technical talent there is across the continent.
This is fascinating. You're now the world's largest technical talent marketplace, which started out in Africa. So you were doing this before the whole world went remote because of the pandemic. You were ahead of your game by a couple of years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In 2014, we looked even crazier.
In 2014, this must have been insane.
Yeah, but it was really fun, though. It was really fun. Yeah, because what was clear, and our founding premise is that we believe brilliance is evenly distributed, even if opportunity isn't. And when you look at a country like Nigeria, you have 200 million people with extraordinary hustle and drive. You look at that and realize if there isn't a meaningful connection into the global economy, there must be amazing human capital. It just must exist by default. And we were able to find really extraordinary people, and I think that was part of how we were able to help the world begin to see that, in fact, brilliance is evenly distributed.
And before 2020, before the pandemic, you had these beautiful campuses in Nairobi in Kenya, in Lagos in Nigeria, sort of like Google-like, all the perks, beautiful foosballs, all of those nice little things that make people want to go to the office. But then you did a big pivot because of the pandemic. What happened?
I gotta say, I do miss those campuses. What happened was we actually, a year and a half before that, we opened up in Egypt. And that was the first time we opened up a country where we didn't have a physical office or physical presence. And it very quickly grew. In fact, it became, within a year and a half, one of our biggest talent bases. And we realized that it was working even without the campus infrastructure. And so we'd already begun this exploration of what would it look like to operate remotely. And when the pandemic hit, we were already thinking this is probably what the future looks like. Well, now everyone's going remote very rapidly.
Right.
We were effectively half remote as an organization, so it was easier for us to lean into that as a strategic decision, and we just kind of didn't look back. We didn't know how long it would take to get back into the office, but we did know that operating remotely requires some different skills and some different approaches than you would in a campus or in an office setting, and we wanted to make sure we were world class at that so that we could help clients all over the world also be world class at it.
So now Andela is fully remote.
That's
Every
exactly
single
right.
employee does not work out of an office anywhere,
With the exception of Kigali, Rwanda.
with the exception of Rwanda.
And that is because of a partnership with the Rwandan government. And as a result, we still have one office there.
So has this affected productivity? Because I know a lot of people here say when people are not there, you can't see them in the office, they're not as productive. This has been a big debate.
Totally. It's a huge debate. And it's usually a debate from people who, if you ask them, how do you think about remote work? They think, oh, I just give people the same instructions as I would if they were in an office. The reality is there are differences in terms of how you manage remote effectively. But if you navigate and if you learn those differences, if you, for instance, document a bit more of what you want people to achieve and what you expect the timeline to be, actually, you end up with a very even playing field in terms of productivity between remote and in office. And what we're going to see is there's an explosion of technology right now. I bet you here in this building, there are 3 different startups, at least, who are working to improve technology for remote management. It's happening all over the world. We're seeing the trends of technology and software to support remote increase dramatically faster than the technology to support in-office work.
Right.
Which means we're actually going to see that productivity trend continue to get better and better, and I think we're going to see the world therefore go back to what it looked like actually right before the pandemic, which was every year 3 to 5% more people are working remotely, especially in technology roles.
But don't you have an extra layer of difficulty or complexity in your case because these developers don't actually work for you day to day. They work for the companies that they are seconded to. So how do you manage, how do you make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing, they're not doing 2 jobs?
Totally. So you're right. It is a layer of complexity, but while it adds complexity, it also simplifies things in some ways as well.
Right.
So as an example, like we have check-ins with the engineers and also with the companies we work with every 2 weeks. These are automated, but it means we're getting very standard, rapid feedback on how people are progressing along deliverables that we understand. So if someone is off, we actually generally know as much or more as engineering managers in those companies, so we're able to then intervene. But also, let's say that you are IBM and you want to open up a development center, in India. There are a few of those already. As soon as you do that and someone says, all right, I'm going to apply to this company and I'm going to do it remotely, yes, they might say I could work with two different jobs there, but if you're applying to Andela and this is the best path for you to get great jobs all over the world, you don't want to get kicked out of the network. You might be okay getting let go from one of those 2 jobs that you have, but you don't want to get let go from all of your future jobs.
Right.
And so you actually create an additional layer of security because people want to be part of that network and therefore the opportunities that come with it.
What is your learning around any misconceptions around hiring global talent or the lessons you've learned from doing this since 2014?
So there are a lot of misconceptions around it. The first is that people worry that if you don't have perfect time zone overlap, that it's actually going to create long-term issues.
So if you're in the US, the company's in the US, your talent is in India. Huge time zone difference.
So that is really complicated, and that's clear, and I think the world understands that, especially in an agile format. That's really tough. But the US and Africa, as an example, where you would have 4 to 5 hours of overlap, as long as you can overlap for a 9 a.m. stand-up and then have a few hours to unpack, we actually haven't seen any decrease in productivity. We still are seeing a very rapid growth in Latin America with the US and with Africa and Europe because of the pure overlap. There's just so much. But you really need 4 to 5 hours and you can make the entire system function. Most people misunderstand that.
That's a really interesting one. You have just we talked at the beginning, you've been in Kenya and in Egypt. Egypt is a big, obviously shining light in MENA, and Kenya they call themselves the Silicon Savannah. We do. So these are 2 major tech centers and ecosystems on the continent. What did you learn, and how is that related to your business?
Yeah, it was an amazing trip. Obviously, the pandemic shut down travel for a while, and as we moved from 7 countries to 175 over the past 4 years, it became harder to try to be everywhere, And so it was really just fun for me to be back. Andela started with a trip to Kenya that Christina invited me to give a talk for the MasterCard Foundation. Now that was before even the concept came to be. It was just the notion of like what could be possible if you were to try to make it easier for the world to work together and try to seek out brilliance. And so in that time, go back to the 2014, 15, 16, the vast majority of our work was identifying talent and cultivating talent across Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and helping that talent build international careers.
Right.
What we've seen over the past 3 or 4 years is a dramatic evolution and really like advancement in software development, like just sophistication in countries like Kenya and Egypt. And what we're now seeing is those countries and companies in those countries competing not just locally, but on an international level in terms of the products that they're building, but also in terms of the talent that they're sourcing. And what that means is that Andela talent is no longer just moving from like essentially like Kenya into Western Europe or Kenya to the US. Instead, we're actually seeing talent from across Africa, across actually major chunks of the Middle East and Latin America, also working with companies in those regions.
Right.
And so Egypt is growing very rapidly. Kenya growing very rapidly as a consumer of technology and a consumer of software development services in ways that were less obvious prior to the pandemic.
That's fascinating because I think one of the misconceptions or the assumptions that companies in these markets cannot afford the kind of talent you're offering, that they will get priced out by Microsoft and Google and by the huge multinationals. But what's changed?
What's changed is that people are starting to look now at the value of the output as opposed to the cost of the input. And so you go back 5 years, you'd look at an initial salary and say, all right, this is 30% more, and so I can't make that work.
Right.
Now people are looking at it and saying, okay, but I'm going to get that product delivered 50% faster. So actually it's less expensive for me to achieve the business outcomes I want by focusing on higher quality talent. And that is something that Google, Microsoft learned very early on.
Right.
And that's why technical talent in the US and Western Europe is so highly compensated in general. Because if you're an outstanding engineer, you can be 2, 3, 4, 5 times as productive as someone else, because what you're essentially doing is using technology to increase your output. And generative AI just increases that. If you're able to leverage, think of it as like, use Copilot as an example, you could increase from an already great engineer, you could increase your output 40 to 50%. So all of a sudden, you're just creating more and more technology leverage for the best developers.
You touched on this a little bit before, but since going remote and coming from 14 countries to 170 countries, what are the geographical trends you're seeing? What are the interesting regions or countries that you're especially excited about right now beyond the original base of Andela in Nigeria and Kenya on the African continent?
Totally. It's worth noting that Africa is the youngest, fastest growing continent on the planet, and so it is also the fastest growing still in terms of technology talent.
Right.
So it's a smaller base still, but growing very rapidly. I don't think that's going to change any time in the near future, and I think the world's going to become increasingly aware of that. I think you're going to see more and more companies also in the Middle East tapping into Africa, as we're seeing especially in Egypt and Dubai now.
Right.
Like, that's going to be a very real trend over the next few years. Latin America is also growing extremely quickly. So Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico have much bigger talent ecosystems than I think the world generally gives them credit for or understands, and we're seeing a big rush there as well.
I saw a study that you did recently about attitudes toward global talent, what different hiring managers are looking for, what companies are looking for. High level, what do you learn from this study? What does it tell you about the global talent, the borderless workforce, and where the trends are heading?
So what it tells us is that 58% of Fortune 500 companies are already exploring borderless talent. Like the notion of global hiring and a global talent base is already real, but it's real in small pockets inside of these companies. And what people are seeing is that it creates a competitive advantage. If you're able to think about millions as opposed to thousands of potential applicants, and you're able to use machine learning to sift through them effectively, you are more likely to get a better outcome in terms of the variables that matter for you. like cost being one of those variables, skill being another variable. And if you're willing to do that, all of a sudden, you become more competitive in your industry. And I think you're going to see more and more companies seeing the data around that and pulling in global talent. And so I think we're in the very early innings of a shift in how the world thinks about talent more broadly, and the degree to which the world feels like it can work together. It's one of the reasons I'm excited to be here right now. I actually think there's a huge amount of activity and excitement around the world, around what's happening in Dubai and the Middle East more broadly. And I think part of that is pulling talent in from all over the world. I think that's part of the story of Dubai, certainly part of the story of the US, and I think that's part of the future of work.
So a lot of Fortune 500 companies are obviously interested, like you say, in remote talent, but what kind of misgivings do they still have? What are some of the reasons why they still have, many of them have mandated return to work formulas, 3 days in the office, 5 days or whatever, because they still, I don't know if it's an element of presenteeism, they need to see you physically there.
Yeah.
What are some of the misgivings still around remote work?
So physical presence and culture are the two that come up the most frequently. So as you mentioned, people who have spent 30 years operating in one way are going to assume that's the right way because it feels natural to them. And so even though we've had this grand experiment for the past few years, there's still a big push to try to go back to the office. Again, I think technology is ultimately going to solve this. I think there are certain companies where it does make sense, but for most companies, if you're thinking about global competition, if you're thinking about how you compete against companies literally from like other countries and other continents, you need to think about optimizing talent because it's your single biggest expense.
Right.
So you won't be able to ignore it. And on the culture front, I think that people frequently, this fly loves me.
The fly one that
People frequently, one of the biggest challenges for humans, I think, everywhere, is that if you haven't spent time around someone, they feel different and a little bit scary to you. Like if you haven't spent time with people from a certain country or region, then your default is to assume that there's something scary there, which just isn't usually true. And so the more you can help people see commonality and understand that honestly our differences are just more relevant and impactful than our commonalities are more different and interesting than our differences, it lets you see and engage with the world differently. But we're still in the early stages of that. I think we've made a lot of progress over the past 50 years, but there's still a lot of like other isms that come from a lack of familiarity. And I think work is the best way to break that down, and remote work in particular.
How many people actually is Andela seeding out there to the world? How big is the company?
So the total talent network is now in the thousands of people actively working with companies around the world.
Right.
But Andela as a company has engaged with or supported over 4 million engineers around the world out of about 25 million. And so the world of talent networks is still relatively small. If you look at all of the platform players today, so you look at Upwork, Fiverr, like Andela, like you combine their total revenue, it's still smaller than Adecco's revenue, the staffing company in France today.
Wow.
So you have a long way to go for this model. It's again in the early days, but it enables you to think about talent in a globalized, much more competitive way. And therefore, I think it's pretty obvious that you're going to see a meaningful expansion here.
The reason why I asked about the workforce is how do you build a culture in a remote environment? Because that's one of the concerns, that if I haven't spent time with this person, how do I know what they're about? How do we build team spirit? And they're in a different time zone, speak a different language. We don't hang out at the water cooler every day.
Totally. I think of culture as how people treat each other when no one else is looking. Like, it's what are the norms of a society or a group of people, and how do they engage? And that's something that's relevant in a remote or in an office environment. Like, I think the way that you treat each other online is part of the culture of an organization, and increasingly, it's a really major driver of the overall culture of an organization. So how you engage on Slack matters. Like, how you set up meetings, how you try to connect and enable people to meet their colleagues and spend time in more personal more personal conversations, not just focused on work, is really important. The proverbial office cooler still exists online, and we spend real time and energy bringing people together digitally to enable that. And I think you're going to see, again, more specificity and more just sophistication around how culture is built online. We spend a lot of time helping companies do it.
bringing people digitally. I wonder if the gossip online is the same as you would if you were physically in the office talking to somebody across.
Definitely. Actually, identity is the key issue there.
Right.
If people are anonymous, the gossip and the challenges get way worse.
Oh,
so
okay.
that's why it helps to not be anonymous.
Okay.
To create a culture where people are willing to speak their truth, but in a public way. And
So,
so
like, own it.
people are rewarded for asking hard questions.
Right.
That's something that's really important, and it enables you to get away from anonymity, which I think actually creates insidious rumors and gossip that
Right.
is really hard to navigate.
Okay, I saw a banner here at North Star that says, the year to imagine AI in everything. Is AI going to eat your lunch? Do you need to this much remote talent if somebody can just have ChatGPT do that?
I think the way that it's going to look is AI is going to do half of the preparation for all of our lunches. Like, it's not going to eat our lunch per se, but it's going to increase leverage for many, many professions. Will there be some professions where there are fewer people required? Yes. Like, every major advancement in technology creates shifts in the human things that are needed
And
to
so
support
some jobs
and
will be
enable that.
eliminated because
Totally.
they can be done by AI.
But net, what happens is some jobs are eliminated, but more jobs are created every single time than were eliminated. And so, is this a big deal? Yes, absolutely. Are we going to see every major company integrating generative AI in some way into their business, even if it's just through the tools that they use? Absolutely. Can you meaningfully reduce costs of, for instance, customer service through generative AI right now? Yes, absolutely. But it's not going to end software development. It's not going to end the need for graphic design. Like, you are still going to have humans that are essentially much more like sort of productive and that are like able to leverage that technology to be much more efficient. And
Right.
that's going to be the storyline of the next 5 years with generative AI. It's the people that are early into leveraging it are going to create productivity gains for their teams that meaningfully outpace the rest of the market. And therefore, I think the hype is warranted, but the fear is not.
So are you already applying AI tools in your businesses at the moment? And do you have your clients saying, help me think through what do we do about this brave new world?
Yeah. I think people kind of connect AI and like, there's a difference between AI and then generative AI. I think
Right.
like AI historically is really mostly just machine learning, and machine learning is deeply like important to Andela and how we operate. Our talent decision engine, so the core, like the sort of central brain of the company, is navigating through millions of profiles to understand who is likely to be the best fit for a given role.
Right.
That has been the case. That's been in place for 3 years now. Like, that's been a long-standing like push that gets smarter and smarter every year. Generative AI is like a different phenomenon that obviously ChatGPT really popularized, about 9 months ago. That's had a major impact on just the conversation around AI. That we're spending it's actually the most requested thing from our clients over the past quarter has been small like sprint teams or scrum teams that will come in and help them think through how should we use generative AI to solve problems and increase efficiency in our company.
Right.
And so we're seeing that request. Like, literally every single day there's a conversation about it, and actually a number of large media organizations have been some of the biggest drivers of it.
Right. So you already talked about clients. So what are the most common requests you're seeing from your enterprise clients, and what kind of skills are they prioritizing in the engineers they're hiring?
So there are a handful of things. One, enterprise clients care about safety and security a lot more than startups. And so the way that we operate with enterprise clients feels more like a private talent cloud for them, where they get to come to us and say, here are the types of people we want our hiring managers to have access to. Here are the restrictions, here are the countries we can operate in, here's the rate cards we can operate with, and we want you to be able to find us the right person that fits all of this criteria as quickly as possible. And so it's a different kind of conversation, but one that is much more deeply tied into like security and defensibility, while also maintaining speed than I'd say historically in the early days of Andela, where we mostly worked with high growth startups. So that's the main conversation. We're also, though, seeing these companies becoming much more interested in like us helping them figure out how to think about the world of borderless talent.
Right.
So how should they think about the countries they want to operate in, the kind of projects they can work with contractors versus needing full-time, the kind of roles that would work with contractors versus full-time. So we spend a lot of time sitting down with enterprise companies and saying, here is your roadmap. Let's talk through your talent strategy more broadly, because we can usually help them accelerate that roadmap by 20-something% while reducing costs by 30 to 40. And so you can enable meaningfully more projects to get done, and therefore more productivity and output for the company.
Has the kind of talent you're onboarding changed? Do you mostly bring in engineers who are already skilled, have experience, or do you have a training aspect of the people you onboard and then move them on to your clients?
So at any given point, there are still 10 to 15,000 software developers around the world who are receiving training from Andela or leveraging Andela to advance their careers. At this point, there are about 500,000, as I mentioned, software developers across Africa. We've had about 175,000 through our training programs.
Wow.
So there's still a meaningful training component, but the majority of people who are accepted into the Andela talent network now actually weren't trained by Andela. We've now gotten to a level of scale where most people coming in have 3 to 5 years of experience,
right,
and an expertise in a specific area. And in that area, they're looking for a chance to prove themselves on a global stage. They want to show the world that brilliance is evenly distributed, but they also want to be paid commensurate with that ability. And so we help them find the best job for them, in some ways like a talent agent. We help them in terms of putting together the team where they're going to be most effective, and we help them to find the company where they're going to be most valued, but also where they're going to have the biggest impact.
You have made 2 recent acquisitions this year, Qualified, which is a talent assessment skills platform, and Kasana, based out of Munich. What is the thinking around these 2? First, what do they do? How do they fit into your overall business strategy?
Yeah, totally. Kasana was an expansion into Germany and into, more broadly, like the European talent ecosystem. And so they were a talent marketplace, somewhat similar to Andela, where we were able to just help them accelerate much faster, but also build out infrastructure there on the ground faster as a result of their network. In Qualified, it was a bit more complicated. Qualified is and was the highest quality technical assessment platform on the internet. It was also the highest rated technical assessment platform. And so hundreds of companies, Apple, Facebook, many others, have used it to assess talent coming into the company to understand who they want to hire and then how to understand the existing talent base at that company. And so for us, it gave us a more data-driven way to understand the existing talent base at our client companies and help recommend talent using data that would raise the bar on what they were already able to do. And so long term, we win when data wins. Like Andela wins when we can show the world not just that, yes, like anecdotally, brilliance is evenly distributed, but actually from a data-driven standpoint, brilliance is evenly distributed. And Qualified is a major step on that journey for us to be able to much more broadly and really cost-effectively help companies understand what their current talent looks like, what they're able to bring in, and then also what Andela talent looks like in comparison to that. And so we're seeing companies use us now just for assessing their incoming talent, even if they don't work with our talent. They can do that now through Qualified. They also can use it to assess their own talent, just to understand and get a benchmark for where they are and the skills they have internally. Upskilling is another major conversation taking place right now, and it's hard to know how to upskill if you don't know where people are currently.
Right.
Qualified enables that.
Because the skills gap is widening, and you are somebody involved in the technical skills space, so you have to make sure that the kind of talent you're seeding out are the best possible ones?
That's exactly right. And really, it's not about, I'd say over the past decade, there's been a lot of conversation around like top 1, 2, 3% talent.
Right.
It's actually a meaningless conversation.
Why?
Well, it's meaningless because what matters is what is the probability of success between a given person and a given job. So one person might be top 1% for one role, but, top 30% for a totally different role.
Right.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So the culture of the company matters, the type of the job, the way the team is structured matters. And so you have to think about those things, because what matters for both the job seeker and the company is not how good either is, but how successful they are together. And you need meaningfully more data, and that's why we spend so much time looking at both sides, but also how people perform over time and who's successful in a given company, because you need to look at that holistically in order to understand probability of success, which is ultimately all that matters.
How do you think through, because of the Qualified and Kasana acquisitions, how do you think through a CEO, this is an acquisition we should make, or we can build this out internally and not go out there and acquire somebody who's already doing this successfully?
Totally. It comes down to speed and cost, which doesn't sound very sexy, I know. But what you're looking at is what would it take for you to recreate that thing? If it's on your roadmap and you want to stick to your plan, but if it's in your plan, if it's on your roadmap, and it could accelerate you faster and more effectively than you'd be able to do it on your own, it's worth taking seriously. And so, we thankfully are in a really strong position now, given sort of that we have been at this for a while longer, and we're at more of a level of scale where we're able to bring global talent to companies, but we're also able to think more strategically about the ways that we increase the value for the companies and talent, both of whom we consider customers of ours. For us to increase the value we're able to drive for both sides of the marketplace. And in doing that, we have to think about, could we buy or build something that is going to enhance that value? And oftentimes, if you find the right team that's working on a problem and has been working on it for years that can help accelerate your time frame, it makes sense to think about that strategically.
All right, in the time we have left, you're the perfect person to ask this about your projections for the future of remote work. I'm sure you'll say first, it's here to stay. You were doing this in 2014 before anybody knew what that was.
Yeah.
So naturally, that I'm sure. But what do you think are the trends, projections for remote work, the borderless workforce, and where it's heading globally?
I think if you take a step back and think about it through the lens of first principles, this all becomes a lot simpler. If you think about reducing your cost base, again, by 20-30%, but increasing the talent pool dramatically. And you think of a world where increasingly you will be able to quantify the output of more and more roles, and already can largely with technical roles. It's hard to imagine a world where most companies don't think of remote as a not just viable, but critical part of their talent strategy.
Right.
Are there times when it's less necessary or less appropriate? Look, I love being in a group of 5 people in a garage thinking through problems. There's energy you get from that. We don't talk enough about the psychological power of being around people. I would much rather be here with you, Larry, right now having this conversation than be on Zoom.
Right.
We both
Naturally.
spend too much time
Me
on
too.
Zoom.
Yes.
That is valuable. But that doesn't mean that in a day-to-day office environment, you need 5 days a week of being next to someone to build strong relationships or to understand productivity. And so I think it's more than just here to stay. I think 10 years from now, we're going to have virtual reality and augmented reality, which feels so good that it's going to feel like we're having this conversation, but we actually will be on different continents.
Right.
At that point, it's completely obvious that you don't need to be next to each other.
Are you trying to sell us on the metaverse? Somebody tried that already. It didn't work out.
And it will come about 2 or 3 more times, and eventually it will work. And
Right.
the question is when, not if. And is that a good or a bad thing? That's not my place to judge. But it's a thing. It's coming. And I think remote work is going to be a trend that you're going to see going back to basically pre-pandemic levels, where 3 to 5% additional software developers and technologists will be working remotely every year. And that will just continue gradually, and then all of a sudden spike
Right.
as technology gets to the point where it can enable it to the point where it feels as psychologically safe as being in an office.
All right, that is a good place to end it. Jeremy Johnson, thank you so much. This has been
Thank you,
fantastic.
Larry.
Please give him a big round of applause.
Thank
Thanks
you
a
all.
lot.